High in the frozen mountains, a cowboy lived alone. His only companions, the silence of wind, the crack of fire, and memories carved in sorrow. But one winter night, that silence was broken, when a woman, bare and desperate, ran into his cabin with a child in her arms. This is their story. The wind had a way of gnawing at the mountains that night, stripping bark from trees and driving sleet in hard, slanting spears across the ridges. Elias sat where he always sat, alone, hunched before the cabin fire with only the rifle leaned against the wall and the hollow creak of the rocking chair for company. The chair had once belonged to his wife, and though she had been gone nearly a decade, he had never been able to part with it. Its sway in the dim firelight was a reminder, equal parts comfort and torment, of the life that had been, and the silence that had followed. His cabin was a rough-hewn square of logs, its roof bowed beneath years of snow, its walls sealed with pitch and patience. The only sounds were the hiss of wet logs on the fire and the groan of wind against the shutters. Elias had grown accustomed to this kind of quiet, the kind that pressed on the chest until a man either learned to live inside it or broke beneath it. He thought himself hardened to it, perhaps even welded to it. That was when the pounding came. It began as a frantic thud against the door, sharp enough to jar Elias from his chair. For a heartbeat he thought it the wind itself, some loosened branch clattering against the frame. But then came another blow, and another, urgent, human, desperate. He seized his rifle, heart hammering, and stood at the door without opening it. Silence followed, save for the storm. Then faintly, the muffled cry of an infant pierced the night. Elias threw back the latch. The woman stumbled in like a wraith, bare as bone beneath the storm, clutching a bundle to her chest. She collapsed half across the threshold, her feet bloodied, her hair plastered with ice. Her eyes burned wide with terror, but it was the child's thin wail that shook Elias to his marrow. Without a word, she fell onto the floorboards, curling around the infant as if the very walls might reach to tear it from her arms. Elias knelt stiffly, the rifle clattering to the side. He lifted the old shawl from the peg, the same shawl his wife once wore on cold mornings, and draped it over the stranger's shivering form. She flinched but did not push him away, only clutched the bundle tighter, eyes darting to every shadow in the cabin. The fire, banked low for the night, sputtered against the cold air rushing through the open door. Elias swung it shut and heaved the iron bar into place. Then he bent to the hearth, feeding kindling, coaxing flame until the cabin glowed with flickering amber. The woman did not speak. She only rocked where she sat, whispering soundless words to the baby, pressing her cheek against its damp forehead. Her skin bore the raw sting of cold, mottled with red welts where sleet had cut at her. Her braid had come loose, strands tangled across her shoulders like a rope frayed from too much strain. Elias stood apart, unsure of his place in this sudden intrusion. The weight of her presence pressed on him in a way he had not felt for years, like snow on a roof beam, threatening collapse. Solitude had been his armor. Now it had been breached by a stranger with a child. He fetched a wool blanket from the bed and laid it beside her. After a long moment, she reached for it with one trembling hand, still holding the baby close with the other. She wrapped them both, pulling the shawl and blanket tight until only the child's small nose and lips were visible. The cries softened into whimpers, then faded into a shallow, exhausted silence. Elias lowered himself back into his chair. The fire cracked, throwing sparks that leapt and died on the hearthstone. He studied her from the shadows, how she held herself rigid despite her exhaustion, how her eyes refused to close though sleep tugged at her. She was not merely cold and lost. She was hunted. He saw it in the way she jolted at each gust against the shutters, the way her gaze flickered to the door as if expecting it to burst open again. He did not ask her name. She did not offer it. In the silence of that cabin, words felt too sharp, too heavy. Instead, Elias let the fire speak, its warmth stretching slowly into the corners. Outside, the storm thickened, rattling the roof with pellets of ice. The mountains groaned beneath the weight of weather. Inside, the stranger curled tighter around her child, shawl and blanket forming a small fortress of cloth. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared into the flames until his vision blurred. Once, long ago, he had sat in this same place while his wife labored in the small back room, her cries muffled but relentless. The midwife's voice had been calm, reassuring, until suddenly it was not. He remembered the stillness afterward, the empty cradle, the silence where a newborn's cry should have been. He had carried the cradle outside and burned it to ash, unable to bear its hollow shape. Since then, the cabin had belonged to him, alone to his grief and to the silence that settled like dust across the years. Now, in that same silence, another child's cry had entered, fragile but alive, and with it came this woman. Wild-eyed, nameless, her very presence pressing against the sealed chamber of his solitude. The firelight cast shadows on the walls, the rocking chair swaying faintly as though stirred by unseen hands, the woman's figure hunched and protective, the outline of Elias himself rigid and uncertain. For the first time in years he felt the measure of another heartbeat within his home, and it unsettled him more than any storm. Elias leaned back and closed his eyes, listening. The woman's breathing was uneven, shuddering. The baby's breaths were softer, steady as a feather's fall. Between those two fragile sounds, he realized, the cabin no longer belonged solely to him. It belonged to them all now, whether he willed it or not. Morning seeped into the cabin slow and gray, a reluctant light dragging itself across the mountains. Elias was already awake, boots planted firm on the floorboards, watching the embers of the fire glow and fade like a tired heart. The storm had left a crust of ice against the shutters, and the world outside was hushed, every branch and ridge blanketed in white silence. The woman stirred where she lay near the hearth. Her eyes opened sharp, cautious like a doe's at the snap of a twig. She pulled the shawl tighter around herself and the baby, her gaze darting first to the door, then to Elias. He did not move, only inclined his head slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement. His silence unsettled her. He could see it in the way her shoulders stiffened and how she shifted to keep the infant closer between them. She said nothing at first, but suspicion hardened her stare. Finally, in a voice hoarse from cold and weariness, she spoke. "You didn't ask me why I came." Elias let the words settle in the air. He rubbed his palm across his beard, the scrape of bristle loud in the stillness. "Figured you'd tell it if you wanted." Her jaw tightened. For a long time she did not answer. She sat upright, hair falling loose from the braid, dark strands framing her face like tangled reins. She pressed her cheek against the baby's head, then whispered, "Men are hunting us. They won't stop." She left it at that, and Elias did not pry. But the weight of her words sank deep, pulling at memories he had long buried. He studied her, and in the shadow of her eyes he saw scars that reached beyond the night's flight, deeper than mere pursuit. The way she clung to the child was not only fear, it was defiance, as though she had already lost too much to yield anything more. Elias leaned back in the rocking chair, its groan echoing softly. He remembered another night, years ago, when cries had filled the cabin. Not cries of terror, but of labor. His wife's face slick with sweat, eyes shining with a desperate hope, the midwife's voice urging patience. Then, the silence. A silence heavier than any storm. His wife's breath gone, the cradle empty, his arms hollow. He had carried that cradle to the barn and set it aflame, watching the painted wood curl and blacken, smoke rising like a prayer refused. That silence had never left. It had followed him into the hills, into every dawn and every firelit evening. Now, sitting across from this stranger, hearing the faint sighs of her child, Elias felt that silence stir, restless as a ghost awakened. The woman noticed his eyes upon her and pulled the shawl closer, braiding her hair with quick, nervous fingers. Her braids were crooked, uneven, strands sticking out like splinters. Elias thought of them as symbols, threads woven to hold together what life had frayed. Yet he could see in them, too, the mark of loss, a braid hastily tied, a life unbraided, by sorrow and stitched together again in haste. Outside, the land mirrored their guardedness. Bare trees stood in black silhouettes against a pale sky. Branches like scars raked across the horizon. Snow lay heavy, blanketing every rock and fence, post-muffling sound disguising paths. It was a land stripped bare, just as both of them were stripped to the bone by what they had endured. The baby stirred, letting out a soft murmur, neither cry nor coo, but a fragile sound that filled the cabin with something Elias had not heard since his wife's last breaths, the tremor of life itself, raw and insistent. It was a sound both foreign and familiar, like a hymn half remembered from boyhood. Elias felt it reverberate in him, unsettling, pulling at the walls he had so carefully built. The woman seemed to hear it too, for her eyes softened, if only for a moment. She kissed the child's temple, rocking slightly, and a fragment of song rose in her throat, low, lilting, almost prayerful. It was not a tune Elias recognized. It carried the cadence of another tongue, maybe two tongues braided together, part settler hymn, part native lullaby. Its strangeness filled the cabin with something at once fragile and fierce, a reminder that the world outside was more tangled than lines on a map or bloodlines in a book. Elias looked away, staring instead at the rifle leaned in the corner. He remembered how he had once thought of using it on himself, in the hollowest days after his wife's passing. He had not done it, perhaps out of cowardice, perhaps out of some stubborn spark that refused to die. Now he felt that spark flicker again, unbidden in the presence of this woman and her child. She caught him watching her and stiffened. "I won't bring trouble on you," she said flatly. "If we must go, we'll go." Elias shook his head, slowly. "Storm's too deep. You won't get far." Her lips pressed thin, but she did not argue. The fire crackled between them, the only witness to their guarded truce. In that moment, Elias realized something. Though they were strangers, though their paths had crossed by chance, they were both prisoners of memory, standing in different ruins. He in the ruins of a home hollowed by death. She in the ruins of a trust betrayed, a life shattered into flight. Neither could speak their full truth yet, but their silence was not empty. It was weighted, layered, thick with the presence of all they had lost. The wind rattled the shutters once more, as if to remind them both that the world beyond still hunted, still demanded, still would not grant them peace. Inside, though, for a fragile moment, the sound of the baby's breath was stronger than the storm. By afternoon, the sky thickened into a bruised gray, heavy as lead, the kind of sky that warns of a storm before the first flake falls. Elias watched it through the crack in the shutter, his gut tightening. He had lived long enough in these hills to know what was coming. The woman must have sensed it too, for she wrapped the baby tighter in the shawl and stayed close to the fire, glancing at him as though searching for some word of reassurance he never gave. The silence between them had softened in the past day, though it was far from easy. It was the silence of necessity, not comfort. By nightfall, the storm came down in earnest. Snow hurled itself against the cabin, rattling shutters, whistling through gaps between logs, pressing into every seam as though intent on swallowing them whole. The roof groaned under the weight of wind and ice. Elias rose from his chair, tugged on his coat, and went out into the teeth of it. The woman startled. "Where?" "Chimney'll clog," he muttered, his voice nearly lost to the roar. He vanished into the white. She pressed to the door, clutching the infant, and heard the scrape of his boots on the roof. Sleet lashed his figure, half swallowed. By night. He hacked at the drifts building along the chimney crown, shoulders bent against the gale. For a moment she thought he might be swept away, another body claimed by the mountain. But then he slid back down, stamping the snow from his boots, his beard crusted with ice. Without a word, he stoked the fire higher, shaking out the sparks, feeding it thick logs that would last the night. She studied him closely then. Not the rifle, not the stoop of grief she had sensed in him before, but the quiet persistence. He moved with the rhythm of a man long used to fighting nature's fury, not with rage, but with the weary steadiness of one who had already lost too much, to waste breath on fear. Later, when the baby fussed, she spoke into the space between them. "Your name. I should know it." Elias, he answered, his eyes never leaving the flames. She nodded once but did not offer hers. He did not ask again. Names were a kind of intimacy, and perhaps neither was ready. Hours dragged. The storm beat against the cabin like a living thing, claws raking, breath howling. The walls creaked, the rafters strained. Yet within, the fire's glow pooled golden, casting Elias's shadow long and sharp against the log walls. The woman rocked the child, feeding him from her breast while the wind shrieked beyond. Lantern light painted her face in pale amber, softening the hardness in her eyes. For a fleeting moment, she looked less like a fugitive and more like a mother, in any homestead bound to life by the fragile tether of a child's need. It was then they heard it. Through the howling gale came the faintest echo. Voices, calling across the valley. Men, their shouts carried, warped by the storm, rising and falling like wolves baying against the wind. The woman stiffened, her entire body seizing. She clutched the baby tighter, her gaze snapping to Elias. Fear flared, in her eyes, raw and unguarded. Elias crossed to the window, lifted the shutter a crack. Snow plastered the glass, but beyond it, dim lantern lights bobbed in the distance, riders moving slow along the lower ridge, their cries snatched away by the storm. He took up his rifle without a word. The sound of it sliding into his hand was like the settling of judgment. He stood at the frosted pane, the barrel resting against his shoulder, his figure tall and immovable. The storm blurred him into silhouette, a dark sentinel against the wall. The woman whispered, almost to herself, "Why? Why would you guard us?" He did not answer. His silence was its own language. To her it was bewildering. This man with nothing, left to lose, who owed her nothing, who had lived years alone, now standing as shield against the danger she dragged behind her. Minutes bled into hours. The riders' voices faded, swallowed by wind and distance. Trails vanished beneath the blizzard's relentless weight. What path they had followed would be erased by dawn. Inside, the three of them endured. Elias kept to his post by the window, eyes sharp despite the weariness pulling at him. The woman tended to the child, rocking and humming in that low, half-native, half-settler tune. Their roles were drawn starkly, he, the silent guard, she, the keeper of life. At last, when the storm's fury dulled to a steady roar, Elias set the rifle down and let his shoulders ease. The woman, watching him with wary eyes, exhaled for the first time in hours. The baby slept, its small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the crackle of the fire. A fragile alliance had been forged, not through trust given freely, but through necessity born together. The storm outside had tested them, pressing hard, at the seams, yet the cabin had held. So had they. As Elias sank back into his chair, the rocking creaked softly, answering the wind's cry. He glanced at the woman who had closed her eyes at last, exhaustion softening her face. And though she still kept her name hidden, Elias felt the first thread of trust binding them, not spoken, not acknowledged, but rooted in the simple fact that both were still alive, and not by their own strength alone. The storm spent itself at last, leaving behind a land buried in white silence. Days passed, slow and heavy, with the snow too deep for travel. The cabin became their world, a narrow arc adrift in a sea of drifts. Elias kept to his rhythms. At dawn, he split wood outside, his axe ringing sharp against the frozen air. She watched him through the frost-blurred window, the baby swaddled close. By mid-morning he returned, showing her how to stack the cut logs so they dried against the wall, instead of molding in the damp. When a hinge on the door sagged loose, he set her to holding the nail steady while he hammered it back. In the evenings, he stirred the iron pot with her beside him, teaching how to keep beans from burning at the bottom. It was not teaching in words, for Elias was not a man of many words. It was teaching in presence, gestures, nods, silence broken, only by the scrape of wood on stone or the hiss of boiling stew. She learned quickly, though she never smiled at her progress. At times, while the baby nursed or drifted in half-sleep, she hummed under her breath. The sound was soft, unsteady at first, then surer, as though memory guided her more than choice. Elias listened in secret, never asking. The tune was strange to his ears, threads of settler hymns woven with cadences that carried the open sky, weight of native songs. It was music from both worlds and neither, like the woman herself. He realized then what he had suspected. She carried a past shaped by more than one people, and likely belonged wholly to none. The unease between them never left. It pressed against the walls as surely as the wind had days before. Elias felt it, sharpen one evening while shifting logs from the stack. The end of one board struck hollow against the floor. Curious, he set it aside and pried at the plank beneath. There, wedged in the narrow dark, lay a rifle. Its wood was stained, the barrel smeared with dried blood. Elias lifted it free and the woman froze where she stood by the fire. Her face hardened, but her hands tightened first around the child. For a moment neither spoke, the air thick as smoke between them. "Yours?" Elias asked at last, his voice steady. Her eyes did not leave his. She swallowed, then nodded once. Yes. He turned the weapon in his hands. It was worn but serviceable, the kind a man carried long through hard country. The blood on it was not old. "Whose?" She hesitated. The fire snapped, the baby shifted, the silence pressed. Then her voice came low, halting, as though every word cost her blood. "My husband's kin, his brothers, cousins, men who've taken to lawless ways. They would sell their own blood for whiskey and coin. When the child was born, they sought to trade him like cattle, for favors owed." Her jaw trembled, but her gaze did not falter. "I would not let them. I broke from them, ran. And they hunt me now for the child, for their pride, for vengeance." The firelight caught the wet shine in her eyes. Elias set the rifle aside, resting it across his knees. A hollowness opened in him then, deeper than before. He had known abandonment. His wife's death had left him with nothing but ashes and silence. But what she spoke of was worse, betrayal by the living, by blood meant to protect, by family turning predator. Elias felt the weight of it press against his ribs. He rocked slowly in his chair, the wood creaking in rhythm with his thoughts. The chair had been hers once, his wife's, where she had sat in the quiet hours of dusk, shawl wrapped close, belly heavy with the child that never drew breath. He had sat in it only after her passing, each creak like a whisper of absence. Now he sat again, but the sound no longer spoke only of grief. It asked something of him, something he had not been willing to face. Decision. The woman stood rigid, her shadow thrown sharp against the wall by the fire. She seemed smaller now, though not weaker, like a figure bent beneath too many burdens, unwilling to bend further. "I will not stay if it means harm on you," she said finally, her voice flat, a shield against despair. "If you turn us out, I will go. I have before." Elias did not answer at once. He stared into the flames, the fire popping and sparking, throwing sparks that died quick against the stone. His solitude had been armor, years thick, forged from loss and silence, yet now that armor split beneath the weight of what he had seen. A woman whose own kin would trade her child like coin, whose only shield was her defiance. The baby stirred, letting out a small cry, the kind that pierced silence sharper than any blade. She bent to soothe him, her shawl falling forward, her braid loose again from its knot. Elias watched her, and in the hollow ache of his chest, he knew. He could not send her away. The rocking chair groaned once more beneath him, the sound of absence turning into something else. Decision. The storm broke days ago, but its silence lingered. The land beyond the cabin stretched wide and white, drifts glinting beneath a brittle sun. Elias knew it would not last. Snow erased tracks, but men with purpose could carve new ones. He had been waiting. the rifle always within reach, his ears tuned to the wind for more than weather. They came near dusk. The first sign was the caw of crows lifting from the pines below the ridge. Then came the faint scrape of hooves against ice, muffled curses carried on the wind. Elias stood at the window, his breath clouding the frosted glass, and saw them, dark figures moving like wolves, circling the slope. The woman felt it before, she saw. She rose from her place by the fire, clutching the child close, her face gone pale. Her hands shook, but she moved with purpose, twisting her hair into tight braids. Each tug of the strands was sharp, almost painful, as though she sought to armor herself with them, to weave defiance into every knot. "They've found us," she whispered. Elias nodded once. He did not speak comfort, for comfort was not his way. Instead, he checked the rifle, ran a cloth over the barrel, and slid a cartridge into place. His resolve was steady, but no longer born of guarding solitude. Something within him had shifted. He would fight now not for the hollow silence of his own survival, but for the fragile dignity of protecting life again. The knock came heavy against the cabin door. 3 blows, more demand than request. "Woman." A voice called, thick with scorn. "We know you're in there. Hand over what's ours and we'll leave you breathing." The woman froze. Her eyes flicked to Elias, wide and trembling, her lips parting as if to beg. He raised a hand steady, bidding her stillness. Then he rose and drew back the bar from the door. The cold rushed in, sharp as a blade. Beyond the threshold, 3 men stood in the snow, rifles slung, coats crusted white. Their faces were rough-hewn, kin to one another, in jaw and brow yet twisted by greed and fury. "This ain't your concern, old man," one sneered. "That woman's blood, that babe too. Step aside." Elias stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, his silence as solid as the log walls behind him. The leader spat in the snow. "Don't be a fool. You've lived long enough to know a man don't stand in the way of kin." Elias's voice, when it came, was low like stone sliding. "She's under my roof, the child too. That makes them mine to protect." The woman gasped softly behind him, the sound lost to the wind. The men shifted, anger flickering across their faces. One raised his rifle half an inch, testing. Elias's own barrel lifted smooth, unwavering. For a moment, time hung taut as a wire between them, stretched near to breaking. Then the wire snapped. A shot cracked through the air, sharp and final. Snow burst upward where a bullet struck near the doorframe. Elias fired back, his aim sure. One man fell hard into the drift, his cry muffled by snow. The others shouted, scrambling for cover, smoke and fire flashing from their muzzles. The woman screamed, crouching low, shielding the child with her own body. Elias stepped forward, rifle bucking against his shoulder, his breath steady despite the chaos. Another figure staggered, clutching his side, dark blood spilling across white snow. The third man, face twisted with rage, charged through the haze. Elias swung the rifle like a staff, catching him hard across the jaw. The man crumpled into the drift, groaning, his weapon lost. Silence fell as sudden as the shots had come. The air reeked of powder, sharp and bitter. Snow lay churned and stained, red where the men had fallen. Elias lowered his rifle, chest heaving, eyes sweeping the ridge for more shadows. But none came. Only the wind remained, whispering over the slopes as if to cover the dead. Inside, the woman clutched the baby so tightly, her hands had gone white. When Elias closed the door and set the bar in place again, she collapsed onto the bench, her breath shuddering. He knelt beside her. Her palms were raw, where her nails had bitten deep from holding the child too fiercely. Without a word, Elias fetched cloth and water, binding her trembling hands with the care of one who had once known tenderness. His fingers were rough, scarred from years of labor, yet his touch was careful, steady. She stared at him, eyes wide, the firelight flickering in their depths. For a long moment she did not speak. Then, slowly, she reached up, her hand grazing the lines of his weathered face. It was not a caress. Not yet. It was a searching, as if to confirm he was flesh and not another ghost conjured by fear. "Why?" she whispered. Elias did not answer, for words would cheapen what had already been done. His silence was the answer, that he had chosen, that he would stand, that life was worth guarding even when his own heart had been long hollow. Between them, the fire crackled, its glow soft and steady. Not romance, not yet. But something stirred, an ember of trust, of second chances long denied. She held the child close, yet for the first time since her arrival, her shoulders eased a fraction, and Elias, staring into the flames, felt the ache of purpose return, fierce and fragile, like the first thaw of spring breaking through winter's hold. The storm's fury had long since spent itself. What remained was silence, vast and brittle, spread across the ridge like glass. The cabin stood steady, smoke trailing thin from its chimney into the pale sky. Beneath the trees, the snow lay trampled and dark in patches where men had fallen. The hunters were gone, claimed by the mountain and by their own violence. Elias stepped outside at dawn, the cold biting but clear, his boots sinking into the crust. The woman followed, the child swaddled close against her breast. She stood with him in the stillness, both gazing out at the ridge where no voices called and no shadows stirred. Only the crows remained, black wings against a world of white. At last she spoke. Her voice was low, roughened by fear and weariness, but steady. "Mariah." Elias turned his head. "My name," she said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Mariah," the word lingered in the morning air, more fragile than snowflakes yet heavier than stone. For days she had kept it hidden, as though names could be stolen like coin. Now, with the danger gone, she set it free. She shifted the child in her arms. "My father was Lakota, my mother settler stock. Neither world ever claimed me. When I defied both, they cast me aside. I thought blood would bind me to someone, to somewhere. But blood betrayed me." Her shoulders squared, though her eyes glistened. "I have nowhere left." Elias listened. His face carved from silence, yet within him her words stirred echoes. He too had been cut from the fabric of belonging. Widowhood had exiled him, not by the scorn of others, but by the hollow of loss. Her story and his were stitched, with the same thread: solitude, sorrow, the long ache of rejection. He saw in her not only survival, but the mirror of his own exile. They did not speak further. Words were small before such truths. Instead, they turned to the work at hand, the yar. Dead were gathered and laid beneath cairns of stone. Elias lifted rock after rock, his back bent, his breath steaming. Mariah stood beside him, the child silent at her breast, handing stones where she could. They did not mark the graves with names, for names mattered little to the wind and snow. But their silence was prayer enough, a dignity the men had not earned in life yet received in death. By noon, the work was done. The cairn stood stark against the white dark humps crowned with frost. The ridge lay quiet again. Back at the cabin, Elias saddled his old mare, a bay long past her prime, yet sturdy still. He checked the cinches, laid a blanket across her back, and tied the reins loose. When he was finished, he turned to Mariah. "You're free to leave," he said simply. "Storms broke. Roads'll open in days. You can take the child down the valley, find your own path." Mariah looked past him, toward the distant slope where the valley opened. The sun glared off the snow, dazzling and endless. She held the child tighter, her lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. Instead, she looked back at Elias, at the man weathered by grief, his face lined by years of silence, yet who had stood in her defense when he owed her nothing. Her gaze lingered on the rocking chair through the cabin's open door, its shadow long in the afternoon light. She had seen him sit there night after night, shoulders bowed, eyes fixed on fire and memory. It was a chair haunted by absence. She understood that now. When she looked again toward the valley, her feet did not move. "I will stay," she said quietly. Elias gave no sign of surprise, though something loosened in his chest. He only nodded once, then lifted her and the child onto the mare's back. He took the reins, walking beside them down the mountain trail. They moved slowly, not as fugitives, but as something smaller and gentler, a fragile family, tentative, yet real. Snow dripped from the pines, melting into rivulets that ran across the path. Beneath the slush, the earth softened into mud, the first sign of spring. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the trail. The child stirred, whimpering, softly before falling back into sleep. Mariah hummed her half-remembered tune, the notes threading through the cold air like a promise. Elias walked beside the mare, his rifle slung across his back, his stride steady. For the first time in years, his steps carried him not into exile but into return. That night, when they reached the lowland camp for supplies, Elias tethered the mare and glanced back toward the mountain. The ridge was hidden now, veiled by dusk. Yet he knew the cabin still stood. The fire would burn again, and the rocking chair, once haunted by silence, would not sit empty. He had thought himself finished, a man eroded by grief. But Mariah and the child had shown him otherwise. In their fragile trust, he had found a new kind of dignity, not in holding on to the past, but in guarding the living breath before him. And so the cowboy who had lived alone for years walked on, no longer alone,